World War II was fought in many countries. Many people know about the fighting in Europe and the Pacific, but fewer know about the battles in places like Burma, Africa, or the Arctic. In this list, we're going to cover 3 of the most forgotten fronts of World War II. Make sure to watch until the end because the last one is a real surprise. So let's get started. Burma. The Burma campaign was part of the larger war in Asia and the Pacific between the British Empire and the Japanese Empire. It was one of the most brutal theaters of the war, with combatants having to contend not only with the enemy, but also with the dense jungle terrain and deadly wildlife. While the war in Europe is remembered by many, the Burma campaign is relatively unknown. This could be due to it being overshadowed by the more prominent battles in the Pacific, such as Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway. However, the Burma campaign was no less intense, and its outcome had significant implications for the course of the war. The campaign began in 1942 when the Japanese army invaded the British colony of Burma. The Japanese were well-equipped and highly trained, and they quickly made advances into the country. The British and their allies were caught off guard and were forced to retreat. As the Japanese advanced, they committed atrocities against the local population, which further enraged the Allies and led to a determined resistance. Despite fierce fighting, the Japanese were eventually able to capture most of Burma, forcing the Allies to withdraw to India. From there, they launched a counteroffensive to retake Burma. This phase of the campaign was marked by heavy casualties and little progress. The terrain was so difficult that it slowed down both sides, and the thick jungle cover provided ample hiding spots for ambushes. Eventually, the Allies were able to push the Japanese back, but the fighting continued until the end of the war. Throughout the campaign, the Allies faced numerous challenges, including the harsh terrain, the lack of infrastructure, and the deadly wildlife. They also had to contend with the Japanese, who were skilled fighters and were able to hold their ground. Despite these challenges, the Allies were ultimately successful in retaking Burma. The campaign in Burma was a major theater of war during World War II. It was a brutal and costly campaign that is often overlooked. The fighting was intense and the casualties were high. But the campaign was ultimately a success for the Allies. It is a forgotten front of the war that deserves to be remembered. Africa. Few people today remember that during World War II, much of North Africa was a battleground between the British, Italians, and Germans. This conflict, known as the North African Campaign, saw some of the toughest fighting of the war and was a crucial part of the Axis powers' strategy. Though it's not commonly taught in schools, it was a critical part of the war. The campaign began in 1940 when Italian forces invaded Egypt. Their goal was to capture the Suez Canal and cut off the supply line between Europe and Asia. The British, who controlled Egypt, were able to repel the Italian invasion. This was just the beginning. A year later, German troops under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel joined the fight. They pushed the British back across Egypt all the way to the gates of Cairo. At this point, the Germans were at the height of their power in Africa. But the British were able to turn the tide of the war with the help of their new leader, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. In 1943, the British launched an attack that drove the Germans back into retreat. The fighting continued for another 2 years, but by the end of the war, the Germans and Italians had been pushed out of Africa. But why is this war so forgotten? One reason could be that it didn't involve major powers like the United States or the Soviet Union. Another reason is that the fighting in Africa was not as destructive as the fighting in Europe or Asia. Still, the North African campaign was a critical part of the war. It was a long and bloody struggle that saw some of the toughest fighting of the war. The campaign is remembered by those who fought there, but it has been largely forgotten by the rest of the world. This is unfortunate. The North African campaign was a critical part of World War II. It was a long and bloody struggle that saw some of the toughest fighting of the war. The campaign is remembered by those who fought there, but it has been largely forgotten by the rest of the world. This is unfortunate. The Arctic. Most people don't realize that during World War II, the Arctic was a battleground between the German and Soviet navies. This conflict, known as the Battle of the Arctic, was one of the most important naval battles of the war. Although not as well known as other naval battles like Pearl Harbor and Midway, the Battle of the Arctic was a crucial part of the war in the Pacific. The battle began in 1941 when German U-boats attacked Allied shipping in the Arctic Ocean. The U-boats were highly effective and were able to sink many ships. The Soviets and British responded by sending in their navies to protect the convoys. The battle was on. For the next 3 years, the German and Soviet navies fought each other in the Arctic. The fighting was intense, and there were many casualties on both sides. Eventually, the Soviets were able to gain the upper hand, and the Germans were forced to retreat. This brings up a good question. Why does nobody know about this battle? There are several reasons for this. First, the battle was fought in a remote location. This made it difficult for the media to cover the events as they were happening. Second, the battle was not as deadly as other battles of the war. While there were many casualties, the numbers were nowhere near as high as, say, the Battle of Midway. Finally, the battle took place during the Cold War. This meant that the Soviet Union was not eager to share information about its military activities. As a result, the Battle of the Arctic has been largely forgotten by the rest of the world. This is unfortunate. The Battle of the Arctic was a crucial part of World War II. It was a hard-fought struggle that saw many brave men give their lives. The battle is remembered by those who fought there, but it has been largely forgotten by the rest of the world. This is unfortunate. These are just 3 of the many forgotten fronts of World War II. The war was fought in so many countries and involved so many different conflicts that it's impossible to remember every one of them. However, it's important that we do remember these conflicts because they were a major part of the war. They may not have been as big or as deadly as some of the other battles, but they were still important. And without them, the outcome of the war could have been very different. Now that you've seen this list, which forgotten front of World War II interests you the most? Let us know in the comments below. We hope you enjoyed learning about these forgotten fronts of World War II. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe for more historical tales. Thanks for watching.